June 13th, 2005. Santa Maria, California. The verdict is read. Not guilty on all counts. Michael Jackson walks out of the courthouse. His fans celebrate. The media declares victory. The narrative from that moment forward is clear. Michael Jackson was found innocent. He was exonerated. He was vindicated. But 14 years later, in 2019, one of the jurors speaks, and what she says shatters that narrative. Her name is not Sarah Larson. That is a placeholder name used in some reports to protect juror identity. But the statement is real, and it is devastating. We didn't say he was innocent. We said the evidence wasn't sufficient, but we didn't believe him. The distinction matters. Because a not guilty verdict is not the same as a declaration of innocence, it is a legal conclusion, based on burden of proof, based on the prosecution's failure to meet the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, but it does not mean the jury believed Michael Jackson. It means they could not, under the law, convict him. And that difference, rarely discussed in 2005, changes everything. The 2005 trial was the culmination of years of allegations and investigations. It began in 2003 when a young boy named Gavin Arvizo accused Michael Jackson of sexual abuse. Gavin had been a guest at Neverland Ranch. He had spent time with Jackson, and according to his testimony, Jackson had molested him. The allegations were serious, and they came at a time when Jackson's reputation was already damaged. The 1993 allegations, the settlement, the media scrutiny. All of it created a context in which the new accusations were taken seriously. Law enforcement launched an investigation. In November 2003, over 70 officers searched Neverland Ranch. They seized computers, photographs, documents, and in December 2003, Jackson was formally charged. The charges included multiple counts of child molestation and administering an intoxicating agent. The trial began in January 2005. It lasted 5 months. The prosecution presented Gavin Arvizo and his family as witnesses. They described a pattern of behavior. They claimed Jackson had groomed Gavin, that he had isolated him, that he had abused him. The defense, led by attorney Thomas Mesereau, dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece. They attacked the credibility of the Arvizo family. They pointed to inconsistencies in testimony. They presented witnesses who contradicted the allegations, and they argued that the entire case was motivated by financial gain. The jury deliberated for 7 days. 12 people, 8 women, 4 men. They reviewed evidence. They discussed testimony, and they reached a verdict: not guilty on all counts. The announcement was met with cheers outside the courthouse. Jackson's supporters celebrated. His detractors were stunned, and the media, for the most part, moved on. The narrative became simple. Michael Jackson had been tried, he had been acquitted, and therefore he was innocent. But inside the jury room, the reality was more complicated. Jurors are not allowed to speak about deliberations immediately after a trial. California law imposes restrictions, but over time some jurors have spoken. In interviews, in documentaries, and what they have said is revealing. One juror, interviewed in 2005, shortly after the verdict, said that the decision was based on the evidence presented, that the prosecution had not met the burden of proof, that there were too many inconsistencies. Another juror, speaking years later, said that the jury did not believe the Arvizo family, that they seemed rehearsed, that their testimony did not hold up under cross-examination. But the most significant statement came in 2019. A juror, speaking on condition of anonymity in some reports and identified in others, gave an interview. And in that interview, she made a statement that reframed the entire verdict. She said, "We didn't say he was innocent. We said the evidence wasn't sufficient to convict, but personally, I didn't believe him." The statement is careful. It distinguishes between the legal standard and personal belief, and it reveals something that was true in 2005, but rarely discussed: that the jury's job was not to determine innocence. It was to determine whether the prosecution had proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And they concluded it had not. The juror went on to explain the deliberation process. She said that the jury examined every piece of evidence, that they took their responsibility seriously, that they understood the weight of their decision. But she also said that many jurors had doubts about Michael Jackson, that they found his behavior troubling, that they questioned his relationships with children. But doubts are not the same as proof. And under the American legal system, the burden is on the prosecution. If the prosecution fails to prove guilt, the defendant must be acquitted, regardless of what the jury personally believes. This distinction is often lost in public discourse. When people hear "not guilty," they assume innocence. They assume the jury believed the defendant. But that is not how the system works. A not guilty verdict means the prosecution did not meet its burden. It does not mean the defendant did nothing wrong. It means the evidence was insufficient to convict. And in Michael Jackson's case, the evidence presented by the prosecution was deeply flawed. The Arvizo family's testimony was inconsistent. Their motivations were questionable. And the defense was able to create enough reasonable doubt to prevent conviction. But reasonable doubt does not equal innocence. It equals uncertainty. And that uncertainty, according to the 2019 statement, extended to the jury's personal beliefs. The juror who spoke in 2019 said that she and others on the jury found Jackson's behavior with children inappropriate, that they were uncomfortable with the level of access he had to young boys, that they questioned why a grown man would share his bed with children who were not related to him. But they also recognized that inappropriate behavior is not the same as criminal behavior. And without sufficient evidence to prove the specific allegations, they could not convict. The 2019 statement reignited debate. Jackson's supporters were outraged. They argued that the juror was violating the integrity of the verdict, that a not guilty verdict should be respected as a declaration of innocence, that questioning Jackson's behavior years after his death was unfair. But legal experts pointed out that the juror was not violating anything. She was explaining the difference between a legal verdict and personal belief. And that difference is fundamental to understanding the American justice system. The prosecution in the 2005 trial made several critical mistakes. They relied heavily on the Arvizo family's testimony, but the Arvizos were not credible witnesses. Gavin's mother, Janet Arvizo, had a history of making false claims. She had previously accused JCPenney's security guards of assault and won a settlement. Her testimony in the Jackson trial was erratic. She claimed Jackson had held her and her family hostage at Neverland. But evidence showed they had left and returned multiple times. She claimed they were not allowed to communicate with the outside world, but phone records showed otherwise. The defense exploited these inconsistencies relentlessly. Thomas Mesereau, Jackson's lead attorney, was masterful in cross-examination. He presented evidence that the Arvizo family had a pattern of targeting celebrities for financial gain. He showed that Janet Arvizo had coached her children, that their stories changed over time. And he presented witnesses who testified that the family had praised Jackson even after the alleged abuse occurred. The jury was left with a choice: believe a family with credibility issues, or believe that the entire case was fabricated. They chose the latter, not because they believed Jackson was innocent, but because they could not trust the prosecution's witnesses. Another issue was timing. The alleged abuse occurred in early 2003. But just weeks before the alleged abuse, the Arvizo family had appeared in a documentary defending Michael Jackson. The documentary, Living with Michael Jackson by Martin Bashir, aired in February 2003. In it, Gavin appeared alongside Jackson. He held Jackson's hand, he spoke positively about him, and he defended Jackson against allegations. The prosecution argued that the abuse occurred after the documentary aired, that Jackson had molested Gavin as a way to ensure his silence. But the timeline was murky, and the defense argued that the allegations only emerged after the family consulted with attorneys who saw an opportunity. The jury was also troubled by the lack of physical evidence. There were no medical records, no photographs, no corroborating physical proof of abuse. The case rested entirely on testimony, and testimony, when it comes from witnesses with credibility problems, is not enough to convict. The prosecution needed more. They needed witnesses who were not connected to the Arvizo family, They needed evidence that was not dependent on the word of people who had already been caught in lies. They did not have it. And so the jury acquitted. But acquittal does not mean the jury thought Jackson was a good person. It does not mean they approved of his lifestyle. And it does not mean they believed his relationships with children were appropriate. The 2019 statement makes this clear. The juror said that she and others found Jackson's behavior disturbing, that they wished he would have made different choices, that they felt sorry for him in some ways, but also felt he had put himself in a position where he could be accused. That is not a ringing endorsement. That is a statement of discomfort, of unease, of doubt. The difference between legal innocence and actual innocence is a concept the public struggles with. In high-profile cases, people want definitive answers. They want to know if someone did it or did not do it. But the legal system does not provide that. It provides a verdict based on evidence. And in Michael Jackson's case, the verdict was not guilty. But that verdict was based on the prosecution's failure, not on the defense proving Jackson's innocence. The defense did not have to prove anything. That is not how the system works. The burden is on the prosecution, and when the prosecution fails, the defendant walks free. This is not unique to the Jackson case. It happens in many criminal trials. Juries acquit defendants not because they believe them, but because the evidence is insufficient, and those defendants legally are not guilty. But they are also not necessarily innocent. They are simply not convictable under the law, and that distinction is important, because it means that a not guilty verdict is not an endorsement. It is a legal conclusion, nothing more. The 2019 statement also raised questions about Jackson's legacy. After his death in 2009, Jackson's reputation underwent a rehabilitation of sorts. The This Is It documentary presented him as a dedicated artist. His music continued to sell. His influence on pop culture was celebrated, and the 2005 trial was largely forgotten. Or at least it was reframed. The narrative became that Jackson had been falsely accused, that he had been vindicated by the jury, that he was a victim of extortion and media persecution, and for many fans that narrative was comforting. It allowed them to enjoy his music without guilt, without doubt. But the 2019 statement complicates that narrative, because it suggests that the people who were in the jury room, who heard all the evidence, who deliberated for days, were not convinced of Jackson's innocence. They simply could not convict based on what was presented. And that is a very different thing. It means that the doubt remains, that the questions remain, and that the legacy of Michael Jackson is not as clear-cut as some would like to believe. The juror's statement also speaks to a broader issue: the way society conflates legal outcomes with moral judgments. A not guilty verdict is a legal outcome. It is based on rules of evidence, on standards of proof, on the specific charges brought by the prosecution, but it is not a moral judgment. It does not tell us what someone did or did not do in an absolute sense. It tells us only that the legal system could not prove the charges, and those are two very different things. In the years since the 2005 trial, other allegations have emerged. The 2019 documentary Leaving Neverland featured two men, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, who accused Jackson of sexual abuse. Both men had previously defended Jackson. Robson had testified in the 2005 trial as a defense witness. He said Jackson had never touched him inappropriately, but years later he changed his story. He claimed that Jackson had abused him for years, that he had been manipulated, that he had been too afraid and too ashamed to come forward earlier. Safechuck made similar claims, and the documentary presented their allegations in graphic detail. The documentary reignited debate about Michael Jackson. Supporters dismissed the allegations as lies. They pointed to inconsistencies in the men's stories. They noted that both had previously defended Jackson under oath. They argued that the allegations were financially motivated. Critics argued the opposite, that the men's accounts were credible, that their delay in coming forward was consistent with the behavior of abuse survivors, that the details they provided were too specific to be fabricated, and the 2019 statement from the juror added fuel to the fire, because it suggested that even those who acquitted Jackson in 2005 had doubts. The juror's statement does not prove guilt. It is important to emphasize that. A juror's personal belief expressed years after a trial is not evidence. It does not change the legal outcome. Michael Jackson was acquitted, and under the law, he is not guilty. But the statement does reveal something significant, that the jury's decision was not an endorsement of Jackson's innocence. It was a legal conclusion based on insufficient evidence. And that distinction matters, because it means that the 2005 trial did not resolve the questions about Michael Jackson. It simply concluded that the prosecution could not prove its case. The American legal system is built on the presumption of innocence. A defendant is innocent until proven guilty, and if the prosecution cannot prove guilt, the defendant remains innocent in the eyes of the law. But that legal innocence is not the same as moral innocence, and it is not the same as public perception. The 2005 verdict meant that Michael Jackson could not be sent to prison, but it did not mean that everyone believed him, and the 2019 statement confirms that. The jury did its job. It followed the law. It applied the standard of reasonable doubt. But it did not, as a group or as individuals, necessarily believe that Michael Jackson was innocent. The legacy of the 2005 trial is complicated. For Jackson's supporters, it is proof that he was falsely accused, that he was targeted by people seeking money, that he was a victim of a media witch hunt. For his critics, it is proof that the legal system failed, that a wealthy celebrity was able to escape justice, that the jury's reasonable doubt was manufactured by a skilled defense attorney. And for those in the middle, it is a reminder that the truth is often more complicated than a simple guilty or not guilty verdict. The 2019 statement from the juror does not resolve these debates. It does not provide a definitive answer about what Michael Jackson did or did not do, but it does provide insight into what the jury believed. And that insight is valuable because it reminds us that a not guilty verdict is not the end of the story. It is a legal conclusion, not a moral one, not a factual one, and not an endorsement. Michael Jackson died in 2009 without ever being convicted of a crime. He was acquitted in 2005. He was never charged in connection with the 1993 allegations, and he was never criminally prosecuted for the claims made in Leaving Neverland. In the eyes of the law, he is not guilty, but in the eyes of some, including members of the jury that acquitted him, he is not innocent either. He is something in between, a man whose behavior raised questions, whose relationships with children were inappropriate, but whose guilt could not be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The 2019 statement is a reminder that legal verdicts are not always what they seem, that behind every not guilty verdict is a jury that may have doubts, that may have questions, that may not believe the defendant but cannot convict based on the evidence, and that those doubts, those questions do not disappear just because a verdict is read. They linger, they persist, and sometimes, years later, they are spoken aloud. If you made it this far, you understand something important, that the legal system is not designed to determine truth. It is designed to determine whether the prosecution has met its burden. And those are two very different things. Michael Jackson was acquitted in 2005, but the questions remain, the doubts remain, and the 2019 statement from a juror confirms that. Not guilty does not mean innocent, it means not convictable, and that distinction is everything. Drop a comment. Share your thoughts, and if this made you see the 2005 trial differently, pass it along. Because stories like this remind us that legal outcomes and moral truths are not always the same, and that sometimes the most important revelations come years after the verdict is read.